How's it going, guys? This is Artsy Omni with another episode of Leakbuster. I wanted to make a quick sort of off-the-cuff video about a recent leak that was brought to my attention. I want to apologize in advance if I sound a little weird. I'm a little bit under the weather, and also it's raining right now, so if you can hear that, I apologize. This particular leak originated on 4chan, of course, 4chan. That should be a red flag right away, but let's just jump into it. So first, I wanted to give you a few general red flags that I think provide some reasons to doubt that this is real. First off, the footage is off-screen, but the screenshots are direct feed. Now this is a weird situation because if you have the ability to create direct feed screenshots, then why wouldn't you take direct feed video of the footage? Now one reason could be that the screenshots were taken using the built-in Switch screenshot feature, but that has me a little bit doubtful because there's no signs of compression, and the compression on Switch screenshots is very, very bad. Now, the resolution of the screenshots does match up with what the Switch would output, but again, without the compression there, it's hard for me to believe that this is a Switch screenshot. Also, a big red flag, the footage does not contain any sound, which is, of course, very convenient if this is supposed to be fake. Now, that's just my general observations about the whole thing, but let's jump into one of these screenshots. Now, immediately we can recognize this stage. This is Yoshi's Island from Brawl, and of course we have two characters here. One of them is the Ice Climbers, and the other is Mario. But notice he has Cappy on his head, which is interesting. Now, let's take a look at the Ice Climbers closer, because we know that the Ice Climbers haven't been seen since Brawl, so it stands to reason that if you're going to make a fake leak of this, you'd have to use the Brawl model or modify it in some way. And these colors definitely are reminiscent of the Brawl iteration of the Ice Climbers, which is another sort of red flag. And if we go back to Mario here, there's Cappy on his head. Now, this is something that I've touched on Twitter a bit. In fact, I've talked about a lot of this on Twitter already, but I think it's weird that people expect Cappy to be on Mario's hat at all times. Now, of course, we all want Cappy to be part of Mario's moveset because that's great representation for a very great game, which is, of course, Mario Odyssey, but there's no reason for Cappy to always be on Mario's hat. And when we look at the teaser trailer, we do notice that there is no Cappy on Mario's hat, and some people have taken that to mean that Cappy won't be in the game, but Cappy only shows up when Mario throws his hat or when Mario's idling, at least in Mario Odyssey. So there's no reason to presume that Cappy would always have to be visible on Mario's hat. It's just like Flood. Flood's not always on Mario's back, but he can use Flood. And also, just because Flood is in the game doesn't mean that Mario has to look like he represents that particular game, Mario Sunshine. Otherwise, you know, when they introduced Flood, they should have given Mario short sleeves or something. I don't know, maybe that's not quite a good analogy, but nevertheless. Another big thing that I think should be pointed out is that this particle effect here, presumably from when the character jumps, it's identical in both of these instances, which should be sort of concerning because that would imply that both characters jumped at the exact same time so that the particle animation is in the exact same frames, and that's highly unlikely in my opinion. Also, if they're identical, despite the fact that they're obviously at different angles toward the camera, that would mean that this is a billboarded sprite or just superimposed on the image. That's also a possibility, but if it was a billboarded sprite, that would be a bit uncharacteristic of this particular visual effect. Because if we look at this effect from Super Smash Bros. On Wii U, this effect doesn't even occur at all when you jump. So that's one particular point of interest. There is, however, a very similar effect when you land. But that effect is not just a billboarded sprite. It's actually, and what I mean by billboarded sprite is that the sprite is always facing the camera. This is often done with 2D images and 3D games. They have them always face the camera so that no matter what angle you're looking at it from, it never looks like just a flat plane from the side or something like that. Now, this effect in Super Smash Bros. For Wii U is comprised of not just a billboarded sprite, but also a 3D radial plane, this sort of donut-shaped flat plane that actually creates a 3D effect. And you can see that when I change the camera angle here, you'll notice that this particular part of it is definitely 3D. So that should raise some concerns for the authenticity of this, but let's go ahead and jump to another one of these screenshots. In this screenshot, you'll also notice that this effect is identical, this particular sprite. Now, this is a paused moment of the game, so it does stand to reason that the effect would be the same, or at the same point in the animation in both of these screenshots. But again, the angle being identical and the fact that this is a lot simpler of a particle effect compared to what we've seen in Smash Wii U, it definitely makes me think that this is not real. Now, a lot of people have pointed out that this might be a mod of some kind. I don't believe that's the case, and I'll tell you why in a bit. But before I do, let's go ahead and jump to the third screenshot, which is of Springman in Spring Stadium. Now, obviously, Springman is a character that a lot of people anticipate might be in this new game. And of course, if he were to be in the game, he should bring a stage with him, and Spring Stadium would be a nice contender for that. But there's a lot of elements of this that make me sort of wary of whether or not this is real. Now, of course, ARMS is a new IP that a lot of people think deserves to be in Super Smash Bros. And of course, Springman would be a great contender to represent that franchise. However, we already know that the director of that game, Mr. Yabuki, has expressed that it might be too soon for an ARMS character to be in Super Smash Bros. So obviously that creates a bit of doubt as to whether or not this is actually something that will happen. But regardless, let's take a look at the screenshot. Now, a lot of these assets are taken straight out of ARMS, or at least they look very, very, very similar to ARMS. So either that means that these models are directly from the game, or they ripped the models and used them as a reference to recreate these elements. Of course, that would be a lot of work, but I mean, this person's clearly willing to put in a lot of work to try to make this look as authentic as possible. And of course, I am sort of biased as to whether or not this is real or fake. Personally, I think it's fake. Now, this Springman model isn't exactly the same from the one in ARMS, although it is very, very similar. The problem is it's a lot more high resolution. That's to say that there's a lot more polygons. Now, the fact that this is so high resolution should be a red flag in and of itself, because typically Smash models don't have that many polygons. There's a lot of action happening in a game like Smash, so you can't afford to have that many polygons in a scene at one time. And the Switch is not that much of a graphical leap from the Wii U, so we shouldn't expect that the graphics are going to be that much better. Maybe a different rendering engine so that the lighting is better, but definitely the character models should be more in line with what we see on the Switch. And things like Mario Kart, ARMS, Mario Odyssey, the character models aren't that smooth looking, and this looks very smooth. So this is probably a modified version of the ARMS character model. Some of the deformations, specifically on the legs and the feet here, look a little bit strange to me. So that kind of makes me think that this is sort of rigged, and some of these deformations just look a little bit unprofessional. Sorry if that's insulting to the person who made this, but it's just what I'm noticing. Also, something that somebody pointed out on Twitter, somebody by the name of Lowly Riddell, I think. Sorry if I said that wrong, but he pointed out that the ARMS models don't naturally have the hands attached, and that would make sense because you can switch out the hands, or the arms, I should say, with different sort of weapons in the game. So it would make sense that the Springman model doesn't actually have any hands attached, so these would have to be attached manually. And because of that, the scale is probably something that would have to be matched with the model. And these hands are definitely smaller than the hands in ARMS. So that's sort of strange. But I can understand if they wanted to make the hands smaller, because the reason that the hands are so big in ARMS is because that's a point of focus. You want to be able to emphasize those. You want to be able to see the movement. So making those hands very large makes it easier to read what's happening on screen. And in Smash, that's less of an issue because the perspective is different. But it would be likely that the hands should still represent how they appear in the actual game ARMS. So this has me a bit skeptical, but I can at least explain it away somehow. Now, I mentioned earlier that I don't think this is a mod of any existing Smash game, and the main reason for that is this: the shadows. Notice how soft these shadows look, and typically when you have a shadow, like a real shadow, the closer it is to the object, the harsher or the sharper the edges are. And when you get farther away from the object, you have it sort of start to soften a bit, and we call this part the penumbra of the shadow. Now, no Smash game has an engine that has shadows with this much fidelity. The resolution of this shadow is very, very high, which is uncharacteristic of Switch games across the board. If you look at Switch games, the shadows are quite pixelated, and that makes sense because to get more resolution in the shadows, you have to have more power, and shadows aren't that important, like cast shadows like this. But also, none of the shadows in games like Splatoon 2, Mario Odyssey, Super Smash Bros. On the Wii U, none of those games have these soft shadows. They're all very hard, and that's because those are easier to render. They just don't take as much processing. So that should be a very huge red flag. Graphically, this is just so far above what we could expect on the Switch. So what is rendering this particular screenshot? My assumption is that this is actually pre-rendered, because if you were using a rendering engine like Cycles and Blender or V-Ray, you would be able to get these very nice soft-looking shadows without any sort of aliasing, no stair-stepping, no pixelation. Now we can see just how dynamic these shadows are in the video, but before we do that, I wanted to talk about the UI. Now all of these screenshots feature the pause screen UI, but it doesn't feel real to me, and it's sort of hard to pinpoint exactly what doesn't feel real. I think part of it is the fact that the font is strangely rendered. It's got a very thin outline, and the tracking, the space between the letters, is very tight. And that's unusual because usually in games you would tend to see the tracking be too wide, especially in a game that's translated from Japanese where character spacing is uniform. So often you would see the letter spacing between characters in Japanese to be very wide, and that would translate also to the font usage in English. But that's sort of presumptuous on my part, so let's not get too far into that. What I think is strange is that when you look at the D-pad on the controls here, on the slide controls, that D-pad doesn't even look like a D-pad. When I first looked at this, I thought that was supposed to be the plus button on the Switch, on the Joy-Cons or on the Pro Controller. So you would think that Nintendo would make sure that this looks like a D-pad, maybe by having the arrows on the icon. I don't know. Something about this just doesn't feel right. And this UI is very derivative of the UI from the Wii U version. Typically, when you jump from one Smash game to another, the aesthetic of the game, the user interface aesthetic, is very different. Melee looks nothing like Brawl, and Brawl looks nothing like Wii U. This particular one looks a lot like Wii U, and that makes me think that the person was unwilling to try to create something more unique. So this person is probably trying to feed off of the familiarity we have with the user interface from the Wii U version. I was not able to identify the specific typeface that's used in this, but for whatever reason, it doesn't feel right. And that could just be my bias, but it's worth noting, I think. Also interesting that they chose to use the GameCube controller interface. Of course, we all want the GameCube controller to be in the game, but I feel like development wouldn't be done using a GameCube controller just because that would be a little bit more inconvenient. But that's all speculation on my part. It's not really any sort of reason to doubt that they would use a GameCube controller. But again, that D-pad there, it doesn't look like a D-pad. It looks like a plus sign. So that's a little bit strange. I know a lot of these observations about the UI are very subjective, so I wouldn't say that any of these are a nail in the coffin or anything like that. UI and typefaces are one of the things that fake leakers constantly don't get right. This one is not that bad, but that D-pad, I gotta say, doesn't look like a D-pad. So let's go ahead and jump to the video now. Now, of course, this video was shot off screen, which is very common for fake leaks. And I think that doesn't really make any sense when they have direct feed screenshots. They obviously, if they're developers, then they would have the ability to create, direct feed footage, but this person has elected to take off-screen footage. And I think the reason that you would do that, if you're trying to make this fake leak, would be to make it impossible to scrutinize the details, like the character models, the animations. It makes it a lot harder to see whether or not things line up with what we expect from games like Smash on Wii U. But again, let's go ahead and take a look. Notice that Decidueye, now this is a character that we haven't seen in the other screenshots yet. Notice that Decidueye is standing still, which would mean either this is training mode. There's no UI for the training mode, so I don't think it's training mode. So if it's not training mode, then that would mean that there's a second GameCube controller plugged in and that the player is not, that the other controller is not being used. Because if it was a computer player, then Decidueye would be trying to attack Springman right now. That's not happening. And again, almost forgot to mention, pay attention to Springman's shadow when he jumps. the shadow becomes so diffused because of the distance between Springman and the ground that it almost fades away entirely. And this is not something that you see in any Switch game that I can think of. And frankly, it's not something that you see in any Smash game that we've had in the past either. So this means that it's definitely not a mod, and it's probably not even running in real time unless it's running a completely different engine that, I don't know, is running on a much more powerful PC or something like that. But this is not something that we can expect on Switch hardware. Now, one notable thing about this is that Springman has an idle animation, a jump, and then an aerial attack. But Springman does not move laterally from side to side at all. And a basic principle of creating a fake leak is that if you show less, then you have less work to do. So if you limit what you're actually demonstrating in the footage or in the screenshots, then you don't have to do as much work, obviously. So if you're not going to make the character move from side to side, then you don't have to do any walking animations or running animations. You won't have to do any of the airborne leaning that the characters do in Smash. It's just a simple idle animation, a jump, a very, very static jump, and then a back air. And of course, it's commendable that this person went to such lengths to actually animate these characters. And again, I don't think this is a mod. I think this is all animated in something like Maya or Blender, and then rendered out frame by frame, not played in real time. So I should give props to this person for actually taking the time to do this. But again, the larger your scope, the more opportunity you create to make mistakes. I appreciate the ambition here, but there are definitely some issues. For instance, Springman's animation is very stiff. You notice that his arms or his hands kind of just move in unison, which looks very strange. It looks like it was sort of rushed, not very professional. And if we look at Decidueye over here, he's standing still. He does this sort of look side to side, sort of weirdly eased. Not the most involved animation here. The feet stay completely planted. It's difficult to scrutinize, again, the model used for Decidueye here, but it's not the model from Pokken. I can actually bring that up here. Pokken's model has a lot more detailing in the feathers on the sides here. So I would presume that this is actually a modified version of the Sun and Moon model. There's not that many models of Decidueye, so obviously you'd probably have to make a new one. But if you look at the contours of Decidueye's like leaf hood and all of that, the tie in the front, the bottom sort of scalloped feather edge here on the bottom, very, very close to the 3DS model, which makes me think that this person didn't want to try to take any creative liberties or visual enhancements when trying to create this Decidueye. So it sort of doesn't look like something that would be in a Smash game. It looks a little bit too primitive from a geometrical standpoint. The textures are nice, but again, it's hard to tell because this is all off screen conveniently. So hard to say whether or not this model is characteristic of something that you would find in Smash. But the person does pause, camera moves over, and then they zoom out a bit, move from side to side. This gives you a much better impression of what the stage is like. Personally, I think this is a weird stage because there's not a lot of distance between the stage and the audience here. If you look at a stage like the boxing ring from Super Smash Bros. For Wii U, there's a lot more space from the edge of the stage to the sort of front of the stands, the bleachers where people are actually standing. And I can show you exactly how much distance there is from the kill plane of the boxing ring to the boxing ring stage itself. It's a much larger distance than this. Again, this stage doesn't really make sense. It feels like you would be able to actually land in the stands here. And I don't know, that's just sort of speculation on my part. Now the stage is quite a bit different. It's been modified heavily from the actual stage that it's based on in ARMS, but a lot of these assets look like they're ripped straight out of ARMS, and that seems to indicate that this was, well, again, it's less work to do that. And so the scope of this particular leak is so big, but there's so much room for error there. I mean, that's the reason why when I was making the Rayman leak, all I did was a character select screen, because I wanted to be able to control every single element, every single detail of that footage to make sure that there were no perceivable errors. And there were some perceivable errors. They were just, I guess, not as noticeable because it was a very subtle effect, like the flames in the background. But everything else, aside from the fact that there was no announcer voice, you know, I was very, very particular about making sure that every single detail was correct. And of course, it wasn't perfect, but, you know. Now, I realize this might sound like I'm trying to, like, brag or something about how the Rayman leak was more convincing or whatever, but I don't think the Rayman leak and this one are really comparable, because this one is so much more ambitious than the Rayman leak was. But that's part of the problem. I think if you're going to make the scope so large, you really do run the risk of missing very important details that will give away the fact that it's not real. If you're going to make a fake leak, don't bite off more than you can chew. If you're not 100% confident that every single little detail is going to be 100% accurate to what we would expect from a real leak, don't try to pull that off. You're not going to do it. Anyways, enough about that. I understand what the mindset is of creating a fake leak like this, so for whatever that's worth. I think that's everything I've been able to catch so far. Quite a few details that sort of tip me off to the fact that this is probably fake. And again, they're very small details, but that's what counts. It's the small details that people who are creating fake leaks are most likely to miss because they expect that people aren't paying that close attention. But, you know, that's my job. I'm the Leakbuster, so hopefully this sheds some light on whether or not this is real or fake. Again, personally, I think this is fake. I think it's fairly obvious, but feel free to form your own conclusions based on the evidence that we have. We've only got a few months until E3. People are starting to get very excited about this new Smash game and they want to know more. And this is prime time to create fake leaks. So expect that there are probably going to be more, but this one I would say is fake. So hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope it was insightful. As always, feel free to let me know if there's any details that I might have missed. Again, this was very off the cuff. I didn't do a lot of preparation, so I'm sure that there's other details that I might not have noticed. There might have been things that I didn't cover that I actually talked about on Twitter, so again, let me know. Remember, try to take these principles that I'm demonstrating in these videos and try to apply them in your own investigations when you're trying to scrutinize or determine whether a leak is real or fake. Look at the fonts, look at the details, look at whether or not these assets are recycled or not. Think of the circumstances. Why is this being filmed off screen in a very dark room? You know, all of these are important factors to consider. So always remain skeptical. Everybody can make a fake leak, guys. If you see any other leaks, be sure to tell me on Twitter. I may not make videos of them. Sometimes it's easier to just tweet about this, and this is something that I tweeted a lot about. If you see any other leaks out there, guys, be sure to send them my way on Twitter. I am at ArtsyOmni. I'm probably not going to make a video about every single one that you send me. This particular one was very large in its scope, so I figured this would be a good one to make a video about, but sometimes I'm just going to tweet about it and make a long thread on Twitter. But either way, if you see a leak, remember to send it to me. Until next time, guys, I have been ArtsyOmni, and I'll see you guys later.